To be a sinner simply means that you're in a lower version of who God really wants you to be, right? And the ultimate thing is to have a life in Christ means now that I am moving into a space now, moving into a space where I am now moving into my higher self.
Welcome back to another healing conversation with your favorite self-care coach and motivator, Abby Speaks. Today, we have a special guest today, and his name is David Bynes. Now, the reason why I say special guest is because he was my former pastor, and to meet him on this path or this journey is very amazing, and so I want him to share his story on his experience, on his transition, and elevating his spirituality, his journey in Christ. So please go ahead and introduce yourself, and also tell us, how were you able to make the decision to break free into that next level, that next step for you?
Sure. Again, first, thanks for having me. Certainly an honor to be on your platform and to receive the invitation. And so, so I'm at this point, I consider myself a spiritually conscious individual. I'm the former, along with my partner, former founder of the Outpour Church that was based in Fort Lauderdale. I am a life and spiritual coach. I'm also a spiritual mentor. I am also a higher education professional of almost 20 years. So I, as I was sharing with you, I sit at the intersections of a lot of different things, right? And so I've always been curious. I've always been, some would say a scholar. And so I love to study. I love to do research. And so even when I was in the church, I didn't come up the traditional route, if you will, but essentially heard the calling, accepted the calling when we were attending a church in Charlottesville, Virginia. At the time, I was working at the University of Virginia, and we're in that area. Did the whole licensing as a Baptist minister, and then I moved back home to Fort Lauderdale. And so through that, we kind of went through the whole church thing, right? And then we decided to start a church. I heard that calling, and so started a church in my grandmother's home, and we just evolved from there. And so in terms of, the breaking free, it was probably about a year and a half in the making for me. Anybody who knows me probably could hear it coming. But I think my own fear would not allow me to really accept it, right? And I still believe that, right? That we don't move into the next of things until we're fully, prepared to do that, right? Or that we understand that we fully heard the call of God to do so. And before we got cut off last time, I was beginning to share with you, and I'll start here. I remember the morning like the back of my hand, right? It was early one morning, probably about 5:30 in the morning. Had a weird dream about, hearing God tell me it was time to move into a more mature place with a more mature believer. I didn't know what that meant. And, and at that time I knew I was evolving. And so I was actually kind of scared. And so I called my spiritual father, Dr. Rick Daniels. And I was like, Pop, I don't know what's going on. I think I probably have gone too far. And so that whole fear-based thing, right? You don't do this, you don't preach another Christ, and you don't do this, or you're going to hell and all this. And I remember that conversation in which I asked him, have I gone too far, right? Because folks were telling me, well, maybe we're not supposed to know certain things, and, we're just supposed to believe God, and be right where God wants us to be. And I remember him saying to me, when you're in this space, it's perhaps you haven't gone far enough. And out of that, I began to derive this understanding that I was living now what I call I was living in between frequencies. And so anytime you live in between frequencies, or for those, anytime you live in between dimensions, and I remember even again talking about this even when I was a pastor or an apostle in the Lord's church, talking about living in between dimensions, living in between frequencies. It causes catastrophic conflict in your life, right? Because you are not at the level of where God has called you to be. And so for me, as I began to ponder that, I stayed in as long as I could, but also because of my own nature and who I am, I could not. You're right. I was never going to be one that was going to lead God's people, in a certain direction. And so we made it a decision that it was time for us to dissolve the church, and step out of that, really sit with God and figure out what the next steps were. And so we did that, helped some people find a new church home, folks that wanted to carry on with us. We took probably about a 2-month hiatus to really sit with God and figure some things out, hear some things. And after that, we launched now what we were calling then the Conscious Freedom Center.
That's good. So then, where you guys, when you guys sat with God and you guys decided to move forward, and now you have a a place where you guys teach, in different terms, right? Consciousness and spiritual awareness. How is that taking you guys? How did that take you guys away from, your familiarity, your family, your friends, and how did that feel?
Yeah. I mean, for a while it was scary, right? It was scary because in the back of your mind, you're hearing all the things of traditional and fundamental Christianity play in the back of your mind. But at the same time, you're thinking, okay, do I listen to that, or do I listen to the present, what I call the present voice of God, right? And so again, I usually challenge people who challenge me. I challenged them with the question of, why is it hard for you to believe that the same God that called me to the apostleship, right, can't be the same God that's calling me to move into this next dimension? Because, and I also share with people, I don't know enough, right? Because I didn't come from a family full of preachers. I didn't grow up in the church, right? And so all I've known on this journey has been the authentic voice of God. And so, so for me, I decided I was going to hear that voice and heed that voice. As I share, I decided I was going to burn the boats and the bridges, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
With colleagues in the ministry, as well as with family who didn't believe. And so while it was a scary journey, it was this place where we had a peace about it, because we knew that regardless of what any man said, man or woman, would say about it, we knew that we were in what most people would call, we were in the will of God, right? And we absolutely believed, and to this day believe that this is where God would have us to be, right? New terminology and all, we're simply now, for most folks, we're probably now simply moving in the metaphysics. But even the Bible speaks to that at some point, you have to stop seeing Jesus right in the flesh and start seeing him in the spirit.
Yes.
And so for me, we were moving into that next place where we were no longer seeing Jesus the Christ only as Jesus, the ego, the personality, the flesh, but we were now seeing him seeing it in the spirit. And as we saw Jesus the Christ, right, we now began to take on this new understanding, this new meaning, new terminology, right, new methodology in terms of our movement, in terms of how we now start to see source energy and where we're supposed to be in that space.
Right. And so you can say from that there is no separation, because I know some people are
Yeah,
like, I'm in the church, so I'm in the right, I'm in the good place of God, and whatever you're doing is literally outside of God. This has nothing to do with God. So you standing, I would say, in duality, because you had ministry in the church, and then you came forth with another kind of ministry. I'm going to say another kind because that's what they call it.
Sure.
But we already know there's no separation. But how would you explain that to someone who isn't aware that it's just a continuation?
Yeah. So one of the, and I have to give him credit, one of the valuable lessons I learned from Dr. Daniels would be this idea of oneness, right? He helped me to understand and break open oneness. And so we know in the scriptures where Christ talks and says, Father, make them one as we are one, right? And so it took me a number of years just to sit with that oneness, right? But when I did, I really came to that reality, and I started going back to the idea of that if, in fact, we all are created by God, who then, or how does any man have the authority to say, this one is a child of God, but this one isn't, right?
Right.
And so the other piece is that if God is omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent, then how is there ever a separation between us and God?
Right.
And so for me, I began now finally to really also heed the words of the Apostle Paul, that it's no longer I that live, but the Christ that liveth in me. And so I began this journey of deep soul searching within. And I stopped looking for God out here and started looking for God in here.
Yes.
And once I did that, I came into the reality, right, of it was the, if you will, decrease or demotion of duality, and now the increase in oneness.
Right.
And so in that, I believe that now Jesus is saying to the Father, help them not only to be one as in one another, right, or one to another, right, David and Addie, but then also help them to be one within themselves.
Right.
So now when I think about this journey of oneness, I have to be one with myself. And as I come into that space of oneness with self, I'm also now coming into oneness with the one consciousness, the one, the oneness of the universe, right? And so, and the more I began to sit in that, I now surely began to understand there is no separation between me and God. Hence now, I can now be created in the image of. And by being created in the image of, it now means that we are one. Yes. The only reason why we have been separated from that is because of our own thinking and the indoctrinated teaching that we were receiving. And that's my opinion.
Yes. And so let me ask you. You said you sat in it for like a year, right? Right. So then when you came into that understanding that, hey, I am one with God and I have this revelation, how did you find the guts to just say, hey, y'all, this is my way, right? This is the way right now for me and my wife and my children. How did you find that route for you?
Number one, again, I would say I felt what people would call the peace of God, right, with it. Secondly, my queen, my wife, my ride or die, my partner, she was on board with it, right? And she, for me, as an apostle, she was always my prophet. So I never made any moves without consulting God and consulting her for the confirmation. So when I finally had the conversation with her, her words to me was, I already knew, God just told me to wait for you. Yeah. And so at that point, again, we knew that everybody wouldn't be on board couldn't be. I won't even say what wasn't on board. Everybody couldn't be on board with it. And so we had to do the righteous thing and release folks. Right. And then again, we had to then sit in it to hear for ourselves. Once we began to do that, it was still a hard journey because you're now losing people, right? Or people are challenging you and saying, bring up all the indoctrination of, you're preaching another Christ, or, or you're leaving the church, right? And, you're doing all this stuff, right? And so basically pushing you outside the will of God when you're trying to say, all I'm doing is what I believe I hear God telling me to do, right? And so, at some point it's fear, but you have to be willing, right, to make the sacrifice. And so I was telling you about that message, right? You have to learn, I got to burn the bridge. Either I'm going to stay in a place where I need to be validated by man, or I'm going to burn those boats and those bridges to make the sacrifice to do what I know that God is calling me to do. I call that living on the frontier. And so I just posted something on my Facebook page last night as I was thinking through this conversation. And I said, you know, once you've lived on, you know, the pioneering edge of the prophetic and the apostolic, the only thing you have to do is now to go forward. Because, and also then in that message about burn the boats and the bridges, I said this point. I said, apostolic people are not called to go back. We're never called to look back. And so if that then be the case, I didn't have a choice but to go forward. And as I went forward, watch this, I started to go upward.
Right. Right. So the next question I want to ask you, because again, this is the Healing Conversation podcast.
Yeah.
So in the healing, I know you said in your story that you and your wife had to do emotional healing. Not only emotional healing, but psychological healing. So what was that like for you? Because I know in my journey, it was tough, because it's like Addie coming from the church, right? And now her mindset has totally shifted.
Right.
And so now I had to heal from letting go of certain people, because the art of letting go itself is tough.
Right.
You know, so now you gotta break free from a lot of people that's now having you to compromise what you see for yourself. And so now I wanted to know the journey to healing emotionally and mentally. How was that journey for you guys?
I'll say this point and then kind of circle back. I don't know that you ever heal. I think healing for me is an ongoing, continuous process. I don't think that's a destination point when it comes to healing. When you think about, you know, we quote unquote lost spiritual sons and daughters, people that you supported, right, from day one, people that you've not only poured into spiritually, but at times you've poured into, you know, financially. You know, you've done a whole lot, right? You, as a ministry gift, we give our life to this, right? And to some degree, we give it when we finally started sitting in it after we, you know, disconnected. We were like, man, we're so broken. We were battered. We weren't quite broke, but you know, but we realized how much money we had given into that space. And so, you know, when you think about all that, that was the pieces now that we had to start picking up. And as we talk about picking up the pieces, it hurts to pick up the pieces, because you also have to reflect on how you got to this place, right? The other thing I would say to the healing journey is that as you begin to move towards, you know, and try to heal, you also have to consider, you know, why you did what you did, right? And so as we begin to consider that part, you know, was you know, brought hurt, right? To some degree, shame. And so, you know, you sit in all that, right? And again, I don't know that there is any specific or, you know, that there's a recipe for it. All I know is that you have to, through the truth, right? And the blessings of source energy, and really allowing the people who want to be there to love on you, is enough. And I'll mention this last piece in terms of healing for me. Again, it was the fact that my wife was still there, right? My prophet was still there, right, by my side. So we were able to have conversations and help each other heal. But I would also say that, you know, one of the people in traditional ministry still, who has proved to be a brother among brothers for me, is Bishop Frank Aaron Lloyd, right? And so I remember having the conversation with him, telling him where I was, And I remember his words, and he said, Doc, nothing will ever change between me and you.
Yeah.
I know who you are. I know what God is doing through you. And when I had that conversation with him, it was enough to kind of seal the deal, to the point that I didn't care who else in traditional ministry would say whatever. And then finally, of course, I still had, at the time, I still had what we call IKEA family, because we had been a part of what we call Kingdom International Alliance, and under Dr. Rick Daniels. And so, had him as a spiritual father, now called spiritual mentor, had several sisters and brothers in that. And oddly, several sisters and brothers in that ministry, I'll say, that also came out of the church. And so we started creating a group, and we were able to have these conversations about how did we get to this place. So all of that, in other words, the healing takes place in community. Right. And so I had to find another community, right, that was doing the same things, moving in the same ways now, but also under the same values, right, and constructs. And so as I did that, the healing started to come.
And I like how you said I had to find another community, because in my transition, I found myself still trying to stick myself in around old people, because I loved them and I honored them, but they were detrimental to my mindset and where I was heading in my life. And so I had to make it. See, everything was falling back on me again. I had to make that decision to go ahead and cut away, not because of anything malicious, but because I respect where I am. I love where I am, and I want to continue here. And so if the respect cannot be reciprocated, then I don't need to be here. This is not my space anymore, and that's okay. Right. And so that's why, I have my little healing community. Y'all go ahead and like the page for Belling Hearts. Go ahead. But before we go, I wanted to ask you, what is an advice that you can give someone who is starting to seek a different route in their belief and in their understanding of Christ and elevating spiritually?
Yeah, I think great question. Number one, I think that for me, I would preface it by saying I still believe in the church. I still believe in the scriptures, because I believe that we all are called to different levels, right? Yeah. So I said to someone one time, just as I honor the fact that you still need to be in the four walls of the church, I would love it if you would also honor the fact that perhaps I'm now in a place where I don't need that in my life, right? And it doesn't mean that I left God, right? And so I honor that, number one. Like I don't bash the church, I don't bash the scriptures, I don't bash people who go to church. Yeah. I also then tell people, understand this. I've been where you've been, but you've not necessarily been where I am. Right? And so you can only look at that and make assumptions about it because you've not walked, right, authentically in that experience. And so with that, I would say to folks, be true to your authentic self, right? Do you. And as you do that, you will find that, yes, it's a hard journey, but it's also a very pleasurable journey. It's a very peaceful journey. But I also tell people who are being elevated in God, right, who are being, transformed and, elevated in the way that they see the Christ, I also tell them that it doesn't necessarily mean that you got to come out of the church. You can still, like, I know some people who are conscious people, but they go to church because either there is a genuine message that's being taught, or they're still going to church because they like the praise and worship and they go and do that. Right. The reality is, though, they know who they are even sitting in the pew or in the chair, right? And so they've submitted them. But the bottom line is that they've made that conscious decision to do that so that they are still in a space of elevation and evolution. And so I would simply tell people, again, take your time with it, sit in it, know that you're hearing from God or source energy. And once you know that, you've heard your instruction and you've been given that direction from, that divine source, then make your moves. Like for me, I still go to programs, right? I have friends that would invite me to do things. A couple of months ago, I went and supported a friend, in their men's ministry. I go, I support, and I kind of feel it out, in terms of if I'm going to get, involved. Or in this case, they had a panel going on, and, Bishop Lloyd kind of called on me, and I was like, but again, in that space, I was true to who I am. And I preface by saying, I know that most of you are not going to be able to hear me, but that's okay. And because for me, I've always been that type of person that, I believe that I'm going to teach high, and it's up to you to come and get it if you want to get it. Right. If not, it's okay, and we'll be all right. And so the only thing I ask for those that are still, in traditional and fundamental Christianity is, to give grace, right? And to, before you start making assumptions, ask the question. Let's have the conversation before you start to assume, because so many people thought, that we've left the church and we don't believe in Jesus no more, and you're doing this and doing that. I actually had an aunt of mine. She'll probably kill me for doing this, but just this past weekend that says, I thought, y'all gave up the church, for financial reasons or whatever. I said, no. I said, we willingly gave up the church because we understood that we were transitioning and coming into a new level of transformation. And so we wouldn't dare lead people that could not follow that, right? And so we did the honorable thing and released people. And for those that said, we want to continue, we understand, we hear where you're going, we feel where you're going, and we sense that we're supposed to be there too, then, we went on. And that was probably about 7 people maybe. But, it led us into a space where we created a smaller ministry, small teaching, and we were able to have authentic conversations and authentic growth and evolution in God.
Yes, I like how you said that. But let me ask you, right? I feel like that when you are in your moment of transition, and so that looks like you're still kind of in the wilderness because you're still hearing from God and you're still cultivating that ear to his mouth. And so the reason why I brought it there is because I remember that I was open to the idea of conversing my stance, and it it was it went downhill. And when I went home after that conversation, I had to use my affirmation, use my tools, my self-care tools, because what was the seed that was planted in me was that you're not educated enough for you to say that your transition is okay, or you're not in a good place, and where I am, this is where you should be, or your healing is not healing. That's just you. But when you come into your true self, we'll be waiting for you at the church and just all that stuff. So I'm over here at home fighting everything that was said just to make sure that I did not forget what God showed me and spoke into me. Because I want people to understand that you can have these conversations, but please do not waste your pearls on swine. And what that looks like is having unnecessary conversation with people that just may not see eye to eye with you.
Right.
And so I want you guys to be careful. If you are okay with the conversation, so be it. But be careful, because it's not necessary for you to have your territory challenged, because God is the ultimate judge. So you don't need nobody to try to check you where you are. That's what I want to say. But what do you have to say about what I just said?
I tell people to sit in it, right? Once you know what you know, then you move in that, right? And so for me right now, I'm in a space, and this may challenge some of your listeners, that I no longer believe that God is a judge.
Yes.
God is a loving Father, yes. Right? Whether I call it God, whether I call it universe, whether I call it divine essence, or whether I call it universal intelligence, it's all the same, right? Yes. Out of that, we come, right? And so in that, then I don't believe that there is a judge, right? I believe that
I'll say like this: not like there's a judge, but like he's the only voice that I
Sure.
listen to, right? Because
Absolutely.
I don't like when people be like, I don't know what you heard, you know. But I know I never left God. That's what I made sure that
You
I tell people I didn't leave God. I just, for me specifically, I just left the four walls,
you
you
can't
know. And I
God.
you can't. That's what I'm saying. Like I was trying to tell them, I was like, how can I leave
Right?
God? Like, what are you guys talking about?
If
So
God is within you, right, and you are in God, you can't leave God.
exactly.
And I know that to a lot of people, that's what I call oxymoron, right? But for me, I can't leave God. If God really is omniscient and omnipresent, I don't care if I'm a saint or what some people will call a sinner. I can't leave God,
Right.
and God ain't leaving me.
Because
And so
it just,
for me, it's
yeah.
about really deeply interpreting, having deeper level conversations, even about the scriptures.
Right.
However you believe them, I believe that there are some spiritual truths in them, but I also now understand for me that the Bible is a document created by man, right? That has written, I now call it code, that has to now be translated, right? And again, though, I don't knock people for what they believe. And so if you need to believe in the traditional Jesus, right, then do that. But now for me, Jesus represents every man and woman that walks the face of the earth as the ego and the personality. And what I tell people now, the Christ. So when we add Jesus to Christ, the Christ is the universal intelligence, right? The Christ is that inner man. And so even when the scriptures either talk about the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus the Christ, or it talks about I must decrease that he might increase, it's talking about my ego, my outside, my shell, right? My personality. In this flesh, I have to decrease so that the inner man or the essence of God that's in me can increase. So we often now talk about how the essence comes through and breaks through the shell. It cannot break through the shell if the shell doesn't decrease itself. So in other words, every man and woman is a formation of the Christ.
Right.
And so every time there's a new birth, there's a new presence of Christ into the world.
Go ahead and teach. Go ahead. I ain't saying that. I just turn it over to y'all don't understand. This is why I was drawn to his ministry. First of all, is because the way you teach and dissect the word, it makes me understand it more. So we know that transitioning, like you said in the beginning, it was scary. It was like a dark place and it was very new, but it was also something that God has called you to do. So now I wanted to ask you, I'm a self-care coach, y'all. What are some self-care techniques that you and your wife took on to make sure that this journey was as smooth as it could be for you two?
Wow. Now that you ask, wow. I think I think the biggest one was finding ourselves in spaces of solidarity with like-minded people, right?
Yes.
We knew that there were going to be enough people against us, and I would say that self-care for us meant pulling back out of public's view, right? We weren't as public, right? We kind of came off of social media. We weren't really in communication with a lot of people. We were trying to, at the end of the day, pick up a lot of pieces of our life. Again, we gave a lot, right, to this idea of traditional Christian ministry. So we had to pick up a lot. And once we came into this understanding that we didn't have to separate ourselves from the world,
Yeah.
because once you come into your own personality and your own understanding of who you are, you can walk among anybody,
Yes.
right? And not be affected by them. That's another story. But once we came to that place, we now started picking up things that we had sat down, right?
Yes.
So for me, I had stopped going to school because I was like, I ain't gonna need that and da-da-da. So I said, now I need to go back and finish my doctorate, right? There were just lifestyles. Like we stopped having fun, right? In life. And so we started figuring out ways to have fun again. But that came through community. and we were just figuring out who it was. I will be vulnerable in this space and say, you know, for me, it helped me, making that transition helped me come or reconnect to my own father. Because I know he loved me, right? But I would say that our relationship had become strained because my father's one of those people who had always been the most authentic version of himself. And so what I didn't realize was that I had the image in front of me all the time.
Exactly.
But in his love, he allowed me, right, unconditionally to go through my phase of wanting to be a pastor and believing I heard God and this and that, and not saying that I didn't. At that level, I did.
Yeah.
But now at this level, and you alluded to this, now at this level, we admit that the God that we hear is the God inside of our own head, right?
Exactly.
So even when we talk about heaven, we talk about it from a linguistic place, heaven and hell, heaven and head, right? Heel and L, right? Higher self, lower self. It's the same concept, right? To be a sinner simply means that you're in a lower version of who God really wants you to be, right? And the ultimate thing is to have a life in Christ means now that I am moving into a space now, moving into a space where I am now moving into my higher self, right? Higher dimensions of functioning, higher dimensions of thinking. And as I do that, I now have no choice but to also invite people into my life that's on that same vibrational frequency.
Yes. I like that. I like that. So, what are two more tips, that self-care techniques that you can give to the audience? Two more.
Love yourself.
Yes.
And love people.
Yes.
Right? I've never stopped loving people, no matter what they may have said or done, right? Or thought they knew about me. So I would simply say, love other people, right? Because again, ultimately, even whether it's the traditional Christian scriptures, whether it's the Quran, whether it's the Tao, right? Whether it's the Buddha, all of which I now study, the intersecting piece is love, right? And I would say, Addie, one of the pieces that got me to thinking, right, that started this evolution for me was I remember thinking to myself, the Bible says, love thy neighbor as you love yourself, not except they be gay or except they be of another religion or whatever. So I started thinking about, like, okay, so how am I really to authentically love if I'm also simultaneously being taught, come out from among them because they sinners over here, right? And so how can I authentically love if somebody that I connected with on the job or in the world, and I connected with them, but you mean to tell me because I'm Christian, I can't really have an authentic relationship with them because at the end of the day, I believe that I'm a child of God and they're not? Or because I'm a heterosexual male, right? Because, and I knew I had spiritual sons and daughters who were in the LGBTQIA community, right? So am I to cut them off because of their lifestyle? Or am I to condemn them and say, you're going to hell? So all of that, right? And the one thing I didn't say is my work through social justice really helped shape this for me. And the deeper I got into my social justice work, I now start to see Christ or Jesus as a social justice champion or a social justice warrior. That began to change my mentality and my interpretation of who Jesus was too. So I would say to love yourself, number one, and love other people. And the final tip would be to know when to step back and step up. And what I mean by that is that there are going to be times on this journey where you just got to step back, right? You don't have to be. I used to believe I had to be all things to all people. I had to answer the phone, right, when one of the, parishioners or sons and daughters called. I had to be able to do this. I had to have all the answers.
Yeah.
On this journey, I don't have to have all the answers because I'm not responsible for anybody else.
Wow.
I'm responsible for me.
Yeah.
And I couldn't be responsible for me because I was trying to be responsible for everybody else.
Yeah. And if I can just interject and say, this is where we will learn to now go into
Yeah,
self and force ourselves to connect to God, because we keep running to people, running. For me, my experience was I was running to these churches and I haven't had yet to connect to God, the true source, the trueness of God. And when I was forced to, I ain't questioning it because I already had experienced God. When I was forced to, I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna stay here because I like it here, I trust here, and I'm growing here. But
yeah,
yes, everything you see, y'all, this man of God, this man of God can talk, okay? And when I mean talk, like he has the knowledge. So Mr. Bynes, where can they find you? Like in what social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, where can they find you and connect with
yeah.
you? and
So
and join your you have a facility, right?
I don't. We let that go, and so we're constantly evolving, right? And so I think the more I learn about who I am and on this journey, you know, I tell people I never want to be in another space, another position where I'm being looked upon as a pastor or a
Right,
leader. If I'm going to be in community, we're going to be in community,
right.
right? Meaning we're in this community together. We're all teachers in the community. We are all learners in the community.
Yes.
I no longer believe in this separation or this hierarchy, right? I believe that if we want to talk fivefold ministry, I freak people out when I say, ultimately, we all should be fivefold,
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
right? So we all should be the apostles of our own life. We
Right.
all should be able to be prophetic. We all should be able to be the evangelists of our own life, and
That's true.
etc. Right? Because that's how we move throughout the world, and that's how God wants us to be in relation with our other brothers and sisters of humanity,
Yes,
not a religion,
yes,
right? Not of a denomination, but the beingness, right, of all. Because as you said at the outset, there's only one consciousness. And out of that consciousness, or God, is the emanations of. And so there's only one. And we are a part of that one. And so
yes.
the more we learn to be part of that one, the more I stop looking at the fault in you and
Right.
start looking through loving eyes. And in this, I would say, even looking through, the eye. There's a saying that says, I got two eyes to look with and one eye to see with, right?
Wow.
As I begin to see through my eye, I don't see the flesh, but I now see who you really are in terms of your universal essence, right?
Right,
Or what we call the beingness of God, right?
right.
Because at the end of the day, if to be present with the Lord is to be absent with the body, then we got to begin right here on earth, looking beyond the body and looking at the spirit, the energy, right? The essence of who that individual is cased inside the body. Therefore, it is my belief that everybody is always in process, right? There's
Right.
a mystic called Mystic Eckhart, right? Meister Eckhart,
Oh,
the
yes.
mystic.
He's really good.
He would say that we're always in
Right.
process. And if we all understand that, and we do, because we say it in the church, like we ain't all got it together, or ain't nobody got it all together, right? That's the same way of saying we are all continuously in process. In process of what? We're continuously in process of growing or evolving, right? And as we do that, we will come into different spaces where we see things differently. Why? Because we are all of the one. There's only one, right? And I know that might challenge some folks, but there's only one.
Yes.
And the concept of, for me, I would say the concept of now even the devil is this idea of a lower frequency, right?
Yes.
A lower consciousness at the heel. He says to the serpent, you will now bite at the heel, right? So the heel represents that lower space or hell for me. And now the head equals that higher place, that higher self, or even that space of where you get this concept, right? Or the consciousness of what we have called heaven for so long.
Y'all don't have any questions? As he tell us where he can be
Oh,
found
yeah.
in the social media platforms, Please drop down any questions in the comments before we go. Please go ahead and tell them where they can find you.
So Facebook, D Daniel Bynes on Facebook. I am on IG under I think at Dope Black Scholar or Dope BLK Scholar. And then I'm also on Twitter under the same name, Dope Black Scholar as well. And so, yeah, so for me, I'm not really teaching a whole lot. I'm starting to come out again as I recognize that the time is coming closer where I'm supposed to launch some kind of next iteration of whatever it will be. I don't know yet. But I'm also in the process of starting a podcast called Becoming Critical, which will highlight my journey as a doctoral student, where I, again, sit in this intersection of spirituality, history, cultural critic, all those things as I journey through my doctoral process and evolve as a critical scholar.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. And I cannot wait to see what more projects you have in store, because I do see that you're sitting and speaking and dropping more gems to the people, because you have people who want to sit under trusting voices. Now, I know I love the concept of togetherness, but sometimes we just want to just hear what you got to say,
Sure.
And so I really appreciate you coming on today to share your story and your enlightenment on spirituality, and that we are one, we are not separated, and God is in us, and that we are always growing and evolving. So again, thank you so much for joining the Healing Conversation podcast. I will call you back to have you on the next episode, because I want us to dive now deeper in spirituality and not more so on the healing, because like you said, it's always ongoing. Right. But now I want you to go deeper in the understanding of spirituality and how to just cultivate that side of you.
And let me say, if we could, before we jump off, it's all healing, Addie. Yes. And it's all healing because as we go through the journey, we start to come into one. So if we ask the question, if we're not one, what are we? Right? We are fractured. And so as we're fractured, right? And so, even in the church, we're fractured, right? We're trying so hard to hold on to this image and to be what God would call us to be, or to be who people, this good person that people would like, right? So that's a fractal I call it a fractal ideology, right? We are fractured, right? Broken. But as we go on this journey, right, to become one within ourselves, that alone is healing, because the healing is the more you become one with self, the more you heal, because you begin to understand once and for all, since coming out of the womb, you start to understand who you really are.
Wow. Listen, you see what I'm talking about? Why we need to sit under you? But again, thank you guys so much for joining the Healing Conversation podcast. And you guys have a great day. So I'll see you soon, Dr. Bynes.
Right. Thank you so much for the invite.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye-bye.